Welcome back to Civil Defiance. I'm your host, Otto Bismarck. Tonight we settle in for a long campaign. We are launching an extended 75-minute assault on one of the most profitable, insidious, and baseless fear campaigns of the modern era. We are targeting the billion-dollar lie built around a humble fungus, Stachybotrys chartarum, a microscopic organism that has been twisted into the monstrous villain the media christened black mold. This is not just a broadcast. This is an indictment of junk science, of predatory capitalism, and of a media ecosystem that feasts on fear. If the words toxic mold cause a knot to form in your stomach, if the sight of a dark spot on a damp wall triggers a wave of panic, if you've ever been handed a lab report with astronomical spore counts and a 5-figure remediation estimate, then you are the primary target of what I am calling the mold scamdemic. The fear you feel is not just an overreaction. It is a carefully engineered, commercially weaponized product. It is the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar industry that has no federal oversight, no consistent standards, and an endless supply of its primary raw material, your anxiety. Over the next 75 minutes, we will conduct a forensic deep dive into this racket. We will trace the panic to its catastrophic and scientifically flawed origins in the mid-1990s. We will expose the criminal absence of federal regulation that created a lawless frontier for predators to operate. We will dissect the unholy trinity of the mold scam, the tester, the lab, and the remediator, a closed loop of financial interest designed to separate you from your money. We will arm you with the simple, undeniable scientific facts that the scam artists desperately hope you never learn, facts about spore counts, control samples, and the fundamental nature of our planet's microbiology. We are not just going to expose the snake oil salesmen. We are going to give you the tools to defeat them. We will dismantle their fear-based business model piece by piece, and then we will delve into the territory they never want you to see: the role of insurance companies, the legal battles, and the psychological warfare they wage on homeowners. This is a complete field manual for defending yourself against the mold scamdemic.
Before we descend into the depths of this fraud, a standing request to the loyal listeners of this broadcast. Civil Defiance is not a monologue, it is a movement. Our work is fueled by your observations, your skepticism, your refusal to accept the official story. Just as our friend Elena consistently provides me with invaluable leads, I want you to become our eyes and ears. What narrative is being sold in your community that you suspect is a lie? What piece of common knowledge smells like a calculated scam? What industry is operating in the shadows, protected by complexity and public ignorance? Send your defiance directly to us. Your target could be the subject of our next deep dive. We are building a repository of truth, a fortress against the propaganda. Stay with us. The first battle begins now. This is Civil Defiance.
Every great panic needs an origin story, a patient zero. For the mold scamdemic, the crime scene is Cleveland, Ohio, during a string of tragically wet years in the mid-1990s. To understand the scam, you must first understand the story they built it on. It is a story of genuine tragedy, which makes its subsequent exploitation all the more despicable. The setting is not a wealthy suburb. It is the forgotten, dilapidated housing projects on the city's east side. We're talking about homes that were old, poorly maintained, and chronically water damaged. These were not pristine environments. They were breeding grounds for every manner of biological agent that thrives in damp, dark places. In this environment, a heartbreaking cluster of infants fell ill with a rare and terrifying condition, acute idiopathic pulmonary hemosiderosis, or bleeding in the lungs. The local health department and eventually the CDC were called in to investigate this medical mystery. They were under immense pressure to find a single identifiable cause. Investigators swarmed these homes and found them to be biological nightmares. The air was thick with bacteria, dust mites, and a veritable soup of fungal spores. And among them, they found high concentrations of Stachybotrys chartarum. It's a mold that loves extremely wet, cellulose, rich material like soggy drywall. In the frantic search for a villain, a premature conclusion was drawn. A correlation was mistaken for causation. A study was published, a press conference was held, and the monster was born. The media, never one to pass up a story involving a silent killer, ran with it. The narrative was perfect. An invisible toxin, produced by a black-colored mold, was killing babies in their cribs. It was a parent's worst nightmare, gift wrapped for the 6 o'clock news. The phrase toxic black mold entered the public lexicon, and the fuse on a billion-dollar panic was lit. But here is the fatal flaw in that origin story, the part that never gets a dramatic headline. Science is a self-correcting process, and the initial Cleveland study came under intense scrutiny. Other scientists couldn't replicate the findings. They pointed to the multitude of other environmental factors at play in those homes. So the CDC did something that is rare and admirable. It revisited the case. In the year 2000, they issued what amounts to a formal retraction. They concluded that the original study was flawed, that a definitive link between Stachybotrys exposure and the infant illnesses was not proven. They stated that the cause was likely a complex mix of environmental factors related to extreme water damage, but it was too late. The retraction was a scientific footnote. The panic was a cultural phenomenon. The monster was already out of the cage, and an entire industry was forming to sell the public protection from it. The myth was more profitable than the reality. This brings us to the heart of the scam, the great regulatory abyss, the vacuum of power where this industry was allowed to fester. To this day, there are no federal standards, no EPA-mandated exposure limits for mold in residential homes. None. We have strict federal laws for lead paint, for asbestos, for radon gas. These are known hazards with clearly defined protocols for abatement. But for mold, an agent purported to be a deadly neurotoxin, there is nothing but a void. A few states have some toothless licensing laws, but there is no national standard of care, no required certification, and no official limit for what constitutes a dangerous level of mold. This absence of oversight is not an accident. It is the central pillar of the mold scamdemic. It created a lawless frontier, a wild west where anyone with a pickup truck and a website can declare themselves a certified mold inspector and prey on public fear with impunity. This void allows them to invent their own standards, to create their own pseudoscience, and to charge whatever the market will bear. Into this lawless void stepped the unholy trinity of the mold remediation industry, the inspector, the laboratory, and the remediator. In a truly ethical transaction, these three entities would be completely independent. An inspector would test, a lab would analyze the data blind, and a separate, unaffiliated remediator would be hired to perform the cleanup if necessary. But the mold industry is a masterpiece of vertical integration and conflicts of interest. Often, the inspector who finds the problem has a financial relationship with the lab that analyzes the sample, and more importantly, with the remediation company that gets the 5-figure contract to fix it. Some companies are a one-stop shop, providing the inspection, the lab work, and the remediation themselves. This is not just a conflict of interest, it is the business model. The inspector is not there to give you an objective assessment. He is a salesman, and his job is to close the deal. His tools are not just an air pump and a flashlight. They are fear, uncertainty, and the illusion of science. He is selling a very expensive cure to a disease he conveniently discovered himself. Let's talk about those tools of the trade. The primary weapon in the mold inspector's arsenal is the air sample. They bring in a calibrated pump and a special cassette called an aerosol. For 15 minutes, the pump sucks a known volume of air through this cassette, which has a sticky slide inside that captures any airborne particles, including mold spores. This slide is then sent to a lab, where a technician looks at it under a microscope, identifies the types of mold spores, and counts them. The result is a lab report that lists different mold species and their corresponding spores per cubic meter of air. This all sounds incredibly scientific. It has pumps and labs and numbers with lots of zeros. But it is, in many cases, a form of scientific theater designed to overwhelm and intimidate the homeowner. The numbers, presented without context, are meaningless, and the entire process is subject to massive, intentional manipulation. The first manipulation is aggressive sampling. A truly representative air sample would be taken under normal living conditions, but an inspector looking to generate a high spore count can do any number of things to skew the results. They might turn on all the ceiling fans. They might use a leaf blower to disturb the dust in a basement. They might take the sample right next to a known area of growth. Their goal is not to assess the air you actually breathe, but to generate the scariest possible number. Then comes the big number terror. The lab report comes back showing 50,000 spores per cubic meter. That sounds apocalyptic. But what they don't tell you is that a single disturbed mold colony the size of a dinner plate can easily release millions of spores. They don't tell you that on a dry, windy day, the outside air might naturally have 100,000 spores per cubic meter. They present the number in a vacuum, knowing you will fill in the blanks with terror. Finally, they present the zero mold lie. They promise their multi-thousand-dollar remediation will leave you with a clean, mold-free environment. This is a biological impossibility, a complete and utter fraud. Mold is a non-negotiable part of our planet's ecosystem. A truly clean post-remediation report doesn't mean you have no mold. It just means the indoor air is comparable to the outside air. They are selling you a fantasy of sterility at an extortionate price. Now, let's arm you with the science to dismantle this deception. This is Mold Biology 101. Fungi are their own kingdom of life, separate from plants and animals. Their job is to decompose organic matter. Without mold, the world would be buried under a mountain of dead leaves and trees. We need them. Their reproductive units are spores, which are everywhere, all the time. The air you are breathing right now contains hundreds, if not thousands, of mold spores from dozens of different species. Most common environmental molds fall into genera like Cladosporium, which is the most common outdoor mold, Aspergillus and Penicillium, which are extremely common indoors and outdoors, and Alternaria, another common outdoor mold associated with plants. These are the background noise of life. Your home is not a sterile hospital. It is a living ecosystem. The goal is not to eradicate mold, but to control it. And the control mechanism is simple: moisture. Mold spores are like seeds. They can lay dormant for years, but they cannot grow without water. A mold problem is never a mold problem. It is always a water problem. This is the single most important fact the remediation industry does not want you to focus on. Now let's talk about the arch villain of this story, Stachybotrys chartarum. Unlike the common mold, Stachybotrys is not something you typically find floating around in the outside air in high numbers. It has large, sticky spores that don't travel far. It is also a slow-growing, non-aggressive fungus. It gets outcompeted by other molds unless it has its perfect environment, constant near saturated moisture for a long period of time, and a food source rich in cellulose. In other words, drywall that has been soaked for weeks from a slow, persistent leak. When an inspector finds a high airborne count of Stachybotrys, that is a significant red flag. It is a bioindicator that there is a serious chronic water intrusion problem somewhere in that building. But the danger is not what they tell you it is. The scam industry has built a mythology around the idea that Stachybotrys produces deadly mycotoxins that become airborne and poison the inhabitants of the house. They will use words like neurotoxin and black mold disease to suggest a danger on par with chemical weapons. This is a grotesque exaggeration. Let's be clear. Certain molds can produce toxic compounds called mycotoxins. This is a scientific fact. These compounds are believed to be a defense mechanism for the fungus. However, the leap from molds produce mycotoxins to the air in your home is a chasm of dishonesty. First, for Stachybotrys to produce significant amounts of mycotoxins, it needs to be under stress, often competing with other fungi. Second, and most critically, these compounds are not volatile. They are heavy, oily substances that do not readily become airborne. They stick to the spores and the mold colony itself. The primary route of exposure for mycotoxin poisoning, known as mycotoxicosis, is through ingestion, eating contaminated food, particularly grains. There is no credible mainstream scientific or medical evidence to support the claim that the airborne concentration of mycotoxins in a water-damaged home is sufficient to cause the systemic toxic effects claimed by the black mold industry. The real documented health effects of mold are almost entirely allergic. For a person with a mold allergy or asthma, a moldy environment can absolutely trigger serious respiratory symptoms. But this is an allergic reaction, not a poisoning. The industry has deliberately conflated allergy with toxicity to amplify the fear and the price tag. This brings us to your ultimate weapon of defiance, the outdoor control sample. Any ethical mold inspector conducting a test for any reason must take at least 2 samples, one inside in the area of concern and one outside to serve as a baseline for what is normal in your environment on that specific day. The goal of mold testing is not to find mold. It's to determine if the indoor environment has a higher concentration or a different profile of molds than the outdoor environment. If your outdoor sample shows 10,000 spores of aspergillus and your indoor sample shows 5,000, you don't have a mold problem. You have a house. If your outdoor sample shows 500 spores of cladosporium and your indoor sample shows 80,000, you have an amplification site. Something inside is growing and releasing spores. That is a problem that needs to be addressed. The scammer will often skip the outdoor sample entirely, or if they take one, they won't show it to you. They will present the indoor number in isolation, because without the context of the outdoor baseline, the number is just a scare tactic. Your first act of defiance is to demand the outdoor sample data. If they refuse or make excuses, you are dealing with a scam artist. End the conversation and show them the door. Now we must enter the shadowy world of junk science and manufactured illness. The mold scamdemic doesn't just damage your walls and your bank account. It has created a cottage industry of manufactured anxiety and phantom diseases. The most prominent of these is the unsubstantiated diagnosis known as toxic mold syndrome. Proponents of this syndrome, often naturopaths or fringe medical practitioners who also happen to sell expensive detoxification treatments, attribute a laundry list of vague, subjective, and common symptoms to mold exposure. We're talking about fatigue, brain fog, anxiety, muscle aches, and digestive issues. These are real symptoms, but they can be caused by hundreds of different medical conditions, from nutritional deficiencies and viruses to depression and sleep apnea. The mold doctor performs some unproven tests, finds a trace of mycotoxins in a urine sample, and declares that the patient's house is poisoning them. This creates a devastating psychological trap. People are led to believe their home, their sanctuary, is the source of their suffering. They spend their life savings on remediation, abandon their possessions, and sometimes even sell their homes at a loss, only to find their symptoms persist. Because the mold was never the primary cause, they have been victimized twice, once by the remediator, and again by the junk science practitioner who sold them a convenient but false diagnosis. Let's follow this chain of economic predation to its next link, the insurance industry. When the mold panic first erupted, homeowners filed claims under their standard policies. Insurers, caught off guard, paid out millions, but they learned quickly. Within a few years, the entire industry rewrote their standard homeowners policies. Today, if you read the fine print, you will almost certainly find a fungus exclusion clause. This clause explicitly states that the insurance company is not liable for any damages, testing, or remediation related to mold, fungus, or mildew, except for a small token amount, often capped at just a few $1,000s, and only if the mold is the result of a specific covered peril like a burst pipe. They have legally walled themselves off from the panic they indirectly helped to create. This leaves the homeowner trapped. Your insurance, which you pay faithfully to protect you from disaster, will abandon you the moment the word mold is mentioned. The remediation company knows this. They know you are alone and paying out of pocket. This is why their estimates are so fantastically high. They are not tethered to the reality of insurance adjusters and standardized pricing. They are tethered only to the depth of your fear and the depth of your savings. So what is the solution? It is not hazmat suits and industrial air scrubbers. The solution is not eradication, it is control. The solution is to focus on the cause, not the symptom. Remember the fundamental truth. A mold problem is a water problem. If you have significant mold growth, you have a significant uncontrolled source of moisture. Your money and effort should be directed there first. Find the leak. Is it a pinhole leak in a pipe behind the wall? Is it a crack in the foundation? Is your roof failing? Are your gutters clogged and overflowing? Is your bathroom exhaust fan venting directly into the attic instead of outside? These are the real problems. The mold is just a biological indicator that these problems exist. Your first call should not be to a mold remediator. It should be to a plumber, a roofer, or a basement waterproofing specialist. Fixing the water intrusion is the cure. Removing the mold is just a cleanup operation. Here is your practical guide to civil defiance against mold. First, control the environment. Go buy a cheap digital hygrometer. Your indoor relative humidity should be kept between 30 and 50%. If you live in a humid climate, your air conditioner is your primary dehumidifier. Run it. If you have a damp basement, run a dehumidifier constantly. Second, if you have a water event from a spill or a leak, the clock is ticking. You have 24 to 48 hours to get the affected materials bone dry before mold can begin to grow. Use fans, use dehumidifiers, use whatever it takes. Porous, organic materials like drywall or carpet that have been saturated for longer than 48 hours cannot be salvaged. They must be removed. Third, if you find a small area of surface mold less than 10 square feet, you do not need a professional. The EPA itself says so. Isolate the area with plastic, wear an N95 mask and gloves, and clean the area with a simple detergent solution. There is no need for bleach, which is mostly water and can actually feed the mold's deeper roots. The key is to clean the surface and then address the moisture source that allowed the growth in the first place. If you have a larger problem or you suspect mold is growing inside a wall, you may need professional help, but you must be the general contractor of your own defense. Never hire a company that does both testing and remediation. Hire an independent environmental consultant or industrial hygienist first. Their job is only to investigate and create a scope of work. They have no financial stake in the cleanup. When hiring a remediation company, get at least 3 different bids based on that scope of work. Check their references. Demand proof of liability insurance. Ask them what their criteria for clean is. The answer should be that the indoor spore counts will be comparable to the outdoor baseline, and the species found inside should be similar to those found outside. Any company that promises you zero mold is lying. Your defiance is in your diligence. You must be more informed, more skeptical, and more demanding than they expect you to be. You must demonstrate that you cannot be intimidated by their pseudoscience and their fear-mongering. We have journeyed through the manufactured panic, the regulatory void, the junk science, and the psychological warfare of the mold scamdemic. We have seen how a genuine tragedy was twisted into a marketing campaign, and how a common fungus was turned into a billion-dollar bogeyman. The establishment has failed you. The media sold you the fear. The government failed to regulate the predators, and the insurance industry washed its hands of the whole affair. The only person who can defend you is you. You must arm yourself with knowledge, and you must defy the narrative. Question the expert. Demand the data. Follow the water, and remember that the goal is not a sterile environment, but a healthy one. This is the essence of civil defiance. It is the refusal to be a victim of profitable lies. And it is a battle we must all be prepared to fight. As always, I want to hear from you. What other scamdemics are you seeing in your lives? What other industries are profiting from fear and misinformation? Send me your targets. Let's choose our next battle together.